Ethiopia has voted to extend its state of emergency by 4 months. It was declared back in October to bring calm after nearly a year of often violent anti-government demonstrations. They began in response to a plan that would have extended the capital's boundaries. Oromo farmers were concerned they'd lose their land. The protests turned violent and then grew, expressing the anger of many Oromos and Amharas who say they are ethnically marginalized and don't have proper political representation, something the government denies. Human rights groups say at least 500 people were killed and thousands were arrested over the 11 months of protest. And some have raised concerns that the state of emergency is being used to crack down on opposition. The Ethiopian government didn't respond to our request for an interview, but their embassy in London gave us a statement saying last year peaceful demonstrations in some parts of Ethiopia were later hijacked by extremists at home and abroad. Since the riots, the government has carried out reforms and has sat down with protesters to listen to their grievances. The House of People's Representatives voted to extend the state of emergency by 4 months with some restrictions lifted. The majority of Ethiopians wanted to see the emergency law extended. Well, to get the other point of view, I'm joined now by Oromo activist Mohammed Ademo in Washington, D.C. He's the founder and editor of opride.com, a website focusing on the Oromo people and the diaspora. Mohammed, good to have you on the program. You heard what the Ethiopian government had to say to us. How much of that do you believe?
Thanks for having me, first of all. I don't believe any of it. And again, as you've just indicated in your report, this is a government that continues to turn to more repressive measures, yet refuses to speak to international press or allow independent investigation to take place in the country. They have very little tolerance for truth, and they're not accountable to the people of Ethiopia. All the changes and the PR they conduct is in an effort to appease their foreign backers and donors and investors. But the reality of the matter is by extending the state of emergency, the Ethiopian government is essentially doubling down on the crackdown as opposed to addressing the genuine and legitimate grievances of the people. And instead of addressing these grievances, they continue to externalize the problem. And instead of taking responsibility and admitting that people have legitimate local grievances and grievances about the rule of law, the respect for human rights, and the release of opposition leaders, the freedom of the press, the civil society organization, generally the tightening of the political space in that country. Instead of addressing all these issues and releasing opposition leaders and people who have been caught up in this massive, expansive security dragnet, they continue to blame external forces and hold marathon meetings. But essentially, the reality is that now we have a military dictatorship where the country will effectively be under some kind of ad hoc military rule under the so-called command post, which is in charge of enforcing the state of emergency.
Mohammed, they point to the violence within the protests, and especially last year, there was some violence. Policemen were killed and so on. Are they lying, or are they maybe misrepresenting the extent of that violence among the protesters?
They are absolutely misrepresenting the violence, but I don't deny that there was a violence. And what happened was the security forces over 11 months period killed more than 1,000 people, and the government says 500. We have names in specific locations of where more than 1,000 people have been killed. Now, no one from the security forces has been held accountable for that. On the other hand, after trying everything they possibly could, the protesters who were, imagine, protesting with empty hands, with their hands raised up to show that they are not holding any weapons and their protests are peaceful, they decided that the government gets much of its legitimacy from foreign investors. And they decided that by attacking foreign investment factories or foreign investors in the country, they could potentially move the government to address their grievances. And they also the feeling from the protester side was the government was not heeding their peaceful demands, which has gone on for 11 months. This is unprecedented in Ethiopia's history. There has never been such sustained, peaceful resistance in the country where the security forces are heavily armed. But despite the fact, the government was not changing anything. So the security forces the protesters decided that they should hit the government where it hurts by uprooting the local institutions that enable this repression of the central state. So they started attacking government installations and foreign companies as a way of getting the government to act, largely in response to a very tragic event that took place on October 2nd, where people were gathered at a lake for a traditional celebration, for a festival, and security forces essentially fired at tear gas and, according to some reports, live ammunition to protesters who were basically demanding to be heard in a very confined space. In the stampede that led to hundreds of deaths. In response, the protesters sort of upped ante so that the government can actually address their grievances. But of course, instead of addressing the grievances, the government decided to institute an emergency rule. Now that's where we are.
Okay, and you mentioned grievances. You say people want their voice heard. For our viewers who are not familiar with this story, if they ask the question, what do the protesters want? If there's one thing that they want, what is that?
Well, there are a number of things. And the first thing is, this is a government that won 100% in the last election. There is not a single member of opposition in parliament in a legislature that is 547 members. Not a single member of opposition. So the people want the constitution to be implemented as it is written on the papers, which allows people to elect their leaders, have fair and equal representation, have equal share in the economy. The economy now, which Ethiopia gets a lot of credit for, is growing. The GDP is growing. But GDP, as you know, is not a perfect measure of the well-being of the people. It's now lifting the people up. The few people at the top are getting very, very rich. People want an equal share of these dividends, these improving fortunes in the country. They want their leaders to be released. Most of the opposition, the legitimate Oromo leaders, are now in jail. That includes Bakala Garba, a champion of nonviolent resistance, who is charged, ironically, for inciting violence while he is agitating for nonviolence means of change in Ethiopia. They want these people to be released. And they also, there is this whole protest was triggered by a massive land grab where the capital Addis Ababa was expanding into Oromo villages and farmlands. They want this to stop. Now, the government says that they've withdrawn the plan that they were put in place, which was supposed to allow the city to expand unhindered for a period of 25 years. They pulled that back, but the expansion of the city continues. People are still being displaced. They want this to stop, and they want fair compensation where they are removed for legitimate development purposes.
Okay, it's been a pleasure having you on the program, Mohammed. Thanks for joining us.